Joe, this is you. I want to just do a little segue. So Joe works with Pierre Omidyar on American democracy. His task is to improve democracy. Thanks for joining us, and welcome to the stage.
Thank you. You love it when we talk about having a break and then we're going to squeeze somebody in right before. Always a really good plan. So this is going to work out great. I've been when Jonah asked me to speak, I said yes, and didn't get a whole lot of guidance as to what to talk about. And I've been kind of sitting here trying to think about what's the right thing to try to convey. And I guess what I wanted to talk about, so I run a private foundation. We give away about $40 million a year for efforts to try to strengthen American democracy. But over the last couple of years, it's become more and more clear to us how small we are relative to the problems that we are facing. And I had a conversation with Pierre and my board about 18 months ago where I kind of put out that now is the time when people are paying attention to these issues in ways that they never have before, at least in my lifetime. I've worked on these kinds of democracy issues for a couple decades now, and it used to be when I would tell people what I did for a living, I'm trying to make democracy work better, the response was that's really sweet, that's so cute, it's really nice, we're going to go solve world hunger. Whereas now I get a very different kind of response. I either get good luck with that, or thank God, right? And there is this kind of this existential sense that these issues related to the health of the American political system are deeply, deeply important to everything we care about, and that our political system is far more fragile than most of us realized or were willing to kind of acknowledge. And so the conversation I had 18 months ago with my board was, now is the time we need to help bring others into the space. We need to start thinking about the role that we play in creating change, not just as the foundation and kind of political actor that we are, but also as an organization that can help enlist others to the fight. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the institution that we've built, but largely to do so because we want to make it available as a resource to others, right? We want to use this institution that we've built in order to help others understand how to come into this space. And because I think many folks around this room are either coming into the space or trying to also help others come in. We want to figure out how to work with you, and I want you to understand what we've got in order to be that kind of partner. So I started working with Pierre Omidyar in 2011. Spent a couple of years inside his philanthropic investment firm called the Omidyar Network. We spun off in 2014. We created a private foundation and then a C4. At the time, it was me and two others. We now have a team of more than 50 people that work across a number of different areas. There are a couple things that I think are unique about the organization, right? So the first is the size. The average foundation that works on the issues that we work on has 3 or 4 people dedicated to money politics or political reform or whatnot. We've chosen to hire up more than 50 people to work on these issues. And the reason, from Pierre's perspective, was he wanted to create an organization that had a lot of internal expertise on the issues we work on, so that the way that we would achieve change is not just through giving away money, but also by being a thought leader, by being a convener, by being a lobbyist and an advocate, right? We want it to be more than a foundation. And I think as it relates to this question of how can we help bring others in the field, it's really interesting that we have all of this internal capacity, right? The team of folks that I have that work on elections are dorks. Like they're really, don't record this, don't try this. So my elections team gets really excited about going to the AMPA conference. Who knows what the AMPA conference is? The American Association of Motor Vehicles for America, right? These are, like, if you care about how people get registered to vote, you gotta care about the DMVs, right? The woman on my elections team has on her speed dial the Postmaster General, right? Because increasingly, the way that a lot of Americans vote is through the mail, whether it's through absentee ballots or whether you live in a state where all voting goes through the mail. So it actually becomes really important to be able to be in conversation with the post office in terms of how they are handling ballots and how they're ensuring that those ballots get counted, right? And so, you know, one of the really interesting things that we've kind of realized is that by having a whole lot of internal expertise, when funders are coming into the space who don't know the space and don't have that kind of capacity, we have folks who can be a resource for them, right? And one of the things we're trying to do is figure out how to train them in ways such that the way they think about their work is not just as kind of the expert and advocate and kind of grant maker, but also as the advisor for others, right? The second thing that's important for kind of and distinguishing about this organization is we take a systems standpoint, right? Our starting place is that we operate in a highly complex system, which means that everything going on is kind of interdependent and bumping up against each other. And anytime you try to make a change, you actually can't predict what's going to happen, right? Because there are going to be any number of different reactions that will interrelate with one another. And that means you need to approach the work with a fair level of humility and assume that you don't actually understand fully what's going to solve the problem. And if you go on our website, you'll see that we've got these crazy systems maps that try to diagram out our understanding of the systems that we work on, right? And our assumption is that we're not getting it right, but that we're doing our best to try to diagram and describe this is how things interrelate with one another, and this is where we see leverage in the system. And we're trying to kind of make those kinds of systems analyses available to others to kind of learn with us as we try to strengthen and shape systems that we're working on. And then the third thing that's a little unique, right, is that we actually really try to work across the aisle. You know, when we got started, the guy who was running my elections program used to work for Chuck Schumer. The woman who ran my governance program had been a Republican chief of staff in the House for 20 years. We work closely in Washington with Heritage Action and Cato and the American Enterprise Institute. We also work with Demos and Brookings and the Center for American Progress. Which does not mean that we are neutral, right? We actually have a core set of values. They probably align more progressive and more left than right. And we try to be very transparent about what it is that we stand for. But we also, kind of with humility, acknowledge that we don't have all the answers, and that in order to create sustainable change, we need to be able to work with folks across the political spectrum. And so that's been kind of core to our work from the beginning. When I think about our mission, lately I've been thinking about it in kind of a bifurcated way. And this is very different, I think, than when we got started. So to me, there's kind of a short-term aspect of our mission and a long-term aspect of our mission. In the short term, we are trying to do everything that we can to stand up to what we see as an authoritarian threat in our politics. Right? We are deeply concerned about the rule of law. We are deeply concerned about the erosion of democratic norms. And, you know, coming out of the 2016 election cycle, we more than tripled our grant-making budget because we felt like, and spun up 6 new lines of work, because we felt like we needed to stand up and against the threat of executive branch abuse of power. So what does that work look like? We have a bunch of work focused on nonprofit investigative journalism, a bunch of work that's focused on kind of government oversight and accountability, like supporting the watchdogs that are using investigations, using the courts, using a variety of other means in order to ensure that the public has a voice in what the executive branch does. We have been a major supporter of efforts to defend the Mueller investigation, and now that the Mueller report is out, to ensure that its findings get a real hearing with the American public. We also, in this kind of short-term work, felt like it was really important that we stand with, as an ally to those communities that are under threat. Most importantly, we've felt that it was really important to stand with the American Muslim community. When you look at the polling and attitudes about Muslims in America, the numbers are pretty scary. We included in one survey asking folks, should American Muslims, which is to say citizens, have the right to vote? And amongst Trump voters, it was something like 30–40% that said no. So it's been really important to us in this environment to be able to stand with those communities that we think are really very much under threat. But that's part of the mission. The other part of the mission is looking at the long term. And from my perspective, it is both irresponsible to only focus on the short term and irresponsible to only focus on the long term, right? Because just as we must stand up to threats today, it's equally important that we kind of acknowledge that the current state of our politics are the result of long-term trends that have been going on for a long time and are going to continue for a long time. And so what we've chosen to really focus on are those institutions and systems within our democracy that are at a kind of transition point because they're under significant stress or pressure for one reason or another. So one example is journalism, right? We all know the basic story here, right? Technology has changed the game in terms of how journalism works, the fundamental business model. We are never going to go back to some kind of imagined golden age of journalism. We can only go forward. Now there's kind of threats and opportunities there. Like the threats rate, there are things that journalism has always done really well that is deeply important to democracy that we need to preserve, right? We need to ensure that the watchdogs have their eyes on the powerful, right? We need to ensure that there's more facts and information out there. And there are things about journalism that have always been pretty shitty, right? That like the journalist as the expert who tells you what you need to know and is really bad at listening, like that has severe consequences for what it means to have a kind of trusted public square, right? Because for communities that feel unheard, misrepresented in what media is producing, it produces all sorts of consequences, whether we're talking about the African American community or rural conservatives, right? And that produces all sorts of really bad reactions in our politics. So we spend a lot of time thinking about what is the future business model of journalism, but also what is the ethos that journalists and newsrooms need to have such that they are more representative of the communities that they cover. We also spend a lot of time thinking about the future of election systems, right? That what does it mean to think differently about the mechanics of our elections in a way that gets beyond the kind of voting wars that we currently experience to a place where we can all trust the results of our elections and that we have as few barriers as possible to voting, right? We also spend a lot of time thinking about kind of governing institutions, accepting that polarization is going nowhere anytime soon. What are the things that we can do to ensure that institutions like Congress can function a little bit better? And that goes from everything from building up relationships across different kinds of divides, right? We support a number of different groups that bring together chiefs of staff in Congress such that they know each other's name, that they know each other's story, that they know each other's families, so that when there is a conflict and they're in the kind of the heat of the moment, the chiefs of staff can kind of call each other and talk each other down and find a way to work together. We spent a lot of time thinking about the procedures and rules within the Congress. We spent spend time organizing trainings and all sorts of things to try to make the institution work a little bit better. So, you know, that's kind of the institution that we've created. As we've thought about what we can do to bring kind of others into this, this field, the focus really has been kind of where can we find funders that are deeply concerned in this moment about our democracy, but can come in a way that they will stay. You know, Donald Trump is no longer in office a couple of years from now. The problems aren't going anywhere. And it's more important than ever at that point for philanthropy to really be exerting leadership in the space at that point. And so there are kind of 4 roles that we've been kind of experimenting with, and you know, would love to talk to folks individually about this and think creatively about other things that we can do and other ways we can be helpful. So the first is we've been trying to really be advisors. And so for each of my teams, whether it's the folks working on journalism or elections or governance, making sure that those staff teams are making a certain percentage of their time available simply to be available to others in the space, to help them do diligence on grantees, to make connections, those kinds of things. Second, we've been creating resources to help other donors kind of understand the space. We gave a grant recently to the Center for High Impact Philanthropy at Penn, essentially to create a guide for new funders coming into the space that kind of breaks down the issues and thinks about them from an evidence-based perspective. For a new funder who's kind of skeptical about where their money can be useful, here's an independent group of experts who's not coming from inside the field, who's saying this is what the research says can be effective. Third, we've been working with what we call kind of channel partners, which is to say those organizations that have connections to people of wealth, so that we can help them to be better resources for their networks, to help them kind of understand the challenges facing democracy. So we've been working closely with the Giving Pledge, right, which is this kind of network that Bill Gates created of billionaires who have committed to give away more than half of their wealth during their lifetime, right? And so we've organized a series of briefings and learning sessions for the Giving Pledge to educate their members about issues facing our democracy. I was in Boston last week meeting with a dozen or so wealth advisors to kind of talk to them about these issues, and we're now going to be kind of organizing trainings for their colleagues and staffs. So, you know, trying to figure out where are the intermediaries, where kind of wealth comes together, and again, in a way that we don't have a whole lot of ego in it. We don't really care if people end up putting money into the things that we put money into. We want to bring the philanthropic leadership into the space, and if our name never comes up by this wealth advisor who we train on these issues, cool. We want to make sure that they have the information about the field such that that money can come in and stay, and then we can then learn from those. You know, a lot of kind of new donors that have come into the space end up becoming real teachers for us because they gain their own expertise, exert leadership, and then show us new paths in. And then the final thing that we're kind of experimenting more and more with is we've created a number of kind of joint funds through which kind of new donors who want to just kind of write a check and let the money go to good organizations can work. And so we've done it, especially within the journalism space. There are more than a half dozen funds that we've created with other partners, whether it is to support local journalism, whether it is to support, right now we're actually creating an insurance company, right? Because if you're a journalist working for a smaller newsroom, you get sued, you're screwed, right? Because you know, the newsrooms of old that had lawyers on staff and insurance policies and all that often doesn't exist anymore. So it becomes important to find a way to give insurance to journalists so that they can actually do hard-hitting journalism and not be worried about losing their livelihood. And so we've created a fund for a nationwide network of legal clinics, and then are now standing up an insurance company. And so this becomes an opportunity for donors who are coming into the space to support that kind of work by just contributing to the fund. we've now created enough of these different kinds of funds, some of which we lead, some of which we're very much in partnership with others, that we're starting to think about how those funds can come together and kind of become a mutual fund of democracy or something like that. I haven't figured out the nifty way to talk about it. But that really there's regardless of the kind of sub-issue you care about as it relates to democracy, there's an easy way for money to come in and be useful in the space. So anyways, that's kind of what we've built, and we want to kind of be a resource for this field, and for those, whether you're in Philadelphia trying to kind of connect to donors there or anywhere else around the country, we want to find a way that we can bring some of the expertise and capacities that we've built to those conversations. I'll just say three more things kind of as it relates to, especially for new funders coming into the space, things that have been important for me to keep in mind, some of which I've referenced already. But so one is, I think it's really easy to come into a new space looking for the silver bullet. And there is no silver bullet for fixing democracy. Rob Ritchie, where's Rob? I love multi-member districts and ranked choice voting, and as you know, that will not solve our democracy together. You know, I think redistricting reform is deeply important. Civic education is deeply important. But any one of those kinds of reforms and changes is not going to, on its own, fix our democracy. And so I want to kind of encourage folks everyone needs to kind of latch on to the solution that they latch on to, but to hold it softly. And appreciate that there's a lot of other work that's also deeply important. I want to again really emphasize, I think it's so important to not view the kind of short-term versus long-term as an either-or, but a both-and. It's deeply important that we stand up in this moment, and it is deeply important that we pay attention to the long-term. And then last, in an environment where we're talking a lot about kind of transpartisan and bipartisan and cross-partisan, and again, I really want to make the argument that being bipartisan or transpartisan or cross-partisan does not mean that you are neutral, right? You may be neutral about tax policy and whether the government should be somewhat bigger or somewhat smaller. You may be neutral about some housing debate, but we cannot be neutral about our democracy, right? And when there is a politics that is threatening to democratic norms, we need to unite against that, and we need to be willing to lose access, lose friends, when it's important to stand up. And just because there is a leader or a faction or a party that is doing things that is threatening that we stand up against, that doesn't mean we're saying that the people that voted for that leader are bad, right? We put out a report, we funded a report that the Cato Institute put out that's about kind of 5 different types of Trump voters, right? And part of what we were trying to do was to say, people who voted for Donald Trump were voting for him for very different reasons. There are very different categories of those supporters. And I think lumping people who are supporting any given leader into just one group and with one rationale, I think is dangerous and not helpful. And it's okay to stand up against the leader who's doing something that's dangerous and still feel like we can work across the aisle. So, anyways, that's my talk. Very little guidance about what I should talk about. And an acknowledgement that we all want to go to our break. So, there you go.
Who is Joe Goldman?
You did very well. So, let's hear from Holly first. We're changing it up. So Holly, as our emotional voice, is your response?
I'd say just grateful that you've been in this